Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, in this segment, we welcome back the wonderful folks from Freedom of the Press Foundation. There are so many things to talk about around press freedoms, around civil rights, and we really can think of really no better people to talk to than the folks at Freedom of the Press Foundation, who are very active in these issues. Of course, they've been on the program before. And I'd like to welcome back to the program Lauren Harper. She is Freedom of the Press Foundation's first Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy, which is a position established to honor and continue the legendary whistleblower's fight for secrecy reform. Lauren joined the Freedom of the Press Foundation after a decade fighting excessive government secrecy with Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit National Security Archive. She served there as public policy director, helped historians, journalists, and the public win declassification of historically significant government documents. And Lauren has a master's in public policy and a master's in Middle Eastern studies from the University of Chicago. Lauren, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an honor to have you. And of course, it is also an honor to welcome back to the program Seth Stern, the director of advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation. He oversees the efforts to promote policies and protect press freedoms and stand up for journalists and whistleblowers who have been, denied their rights. Prior to joining Freedom of the Press Foundation, Seth practiced media and First Amendment law in Chicago for more than a decade. Before that, he was a reporter and editor in Chicago, Atlanta, and lives in the Chicago area. So it is a Chicago-heavy segment. Seth Stern, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
So let's start. There's many things that we have on the docket here, including a recent piece where you all were looking into the Öztürk case, the release of Rümeysa Öztürk. And you talked about FOIA requests. The administration was lying about leaks. Later in the program, of course, we want to talk about some other free press issues around the attacks on nonprofits, around what's happening in higher education suspensions. But Lauren Harper, let's start with you. Can you talk to us about some updates around this very important case?
Yeah, sure. I'll backtrack a little bit. We've been doing some FOIA work into Rümeysa Öztürk's case, but we've also been doing some FOIA work looking at the administration's immigration rationale and how it treats the press more broadly. So to set the scene a little bit, a couple months ago, on March 15th, the Trump administration issued an executive order invoking the Alien Enemies Act as justification for deporting Venezuelan nationals to El Salvador. Invoking this particular act basically said, the Maduro government is operating in coordination with this Tren de Aragua gang. And it was this purported link between the official Venezuelan government and the gang that allowed the invocation of the act. So shortly after the Trump administration issued this executive order in mid-March, reports started coming out of the Washington Post and the New York Times based on leaked information that basically said that the intelligence community had an assessment or a series of assessments that completely undercut the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act as its rationale. And it basically showed that the intelligence community did not agree that there was any coordination between the Maduro government in Venezuela and the Tren de Aragua gang, which just, to sum that up in a bow, basically completely undercut the administration's rationale for its deportations. So this was a growing story. And then in late April, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard said the leaks of this information from the intelligence community to reporters at the Washington Post and the New York Times that contradicted the government's assertions put our nation's security at risk. And they were the actions of deep state criminals, et cetera. And she requested that Attorney General Pam Bondi open multiple criminal investigations into the deep state criminals who had had the audacity to basically communicate with members of the press in order to inform the public that what the Trump administration was doing was based on a lie. So Bondi, she agreed, and she also issued a memo basically saying that the leaks of this information were illegal, made it harder for the Justice Department to protect America. And she also cited the leak of this memo specifically to the New York Times and the Washington Post as a reason to reverse the Justice Department's Garland-era protections for journalists from having federal prosecutors seize their records and demand the name of their sources. So this story was a big deal both for people who are following immigration and for free press issues. So the day that reports came out that Bondi was revoking journalist protections, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for the memo that was specifically cited in the Washington Post reporting. Didn't expect to get anything back based on, Gabbard's tirade against the leak of this information and claiming it so damaged national security. But I got the document released through FOIA 7 business days later, which is really unheard of. You can infer from that there were folks within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, perhaps within the National Intelligence Council, which had produced this memo, that they wanted this article out. I'd be remiss to not mention that a week after this document was released to us through FOIA, not only did it make news, but DNI Gabbard fired the top 2 officials at the National Intelligence Council, and they took down the ODNI and took down its FOIA page for over 24 hours. And now that it's back up, it is stripped of its previously released FOIA documents, which are required to be posted, as well as its FOIA regulations. So this really impacted, it appears, the FOIA work at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as well as perhaps the leadership at the NIC. This relates to the Öztürk case. Because, as folks listening probably know, on March 25th, DHS arrested and detained Öztürk, who is a Tufts graduate student, on the grounds that she supported terrorism. And the only ostensible proof of that was that she co-authored an op-ed criticizing, the Palestinian genocide and calling on the university to divest its ties from Israel. This is related to the ODNI story because a similar memo, a State Department memo, was leaked, I believe, to the Washington Post. And the State Department memo completely contradicted the Department of Homeland Security's claims. It basically said that Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State, did not have sufficient grounds for revoking Öztürk's visa. So we filed a FOIA request for that memo. So far, we haven't gotten it. And in fact, the State Department denied our request for expedited processing, saying that we had demonstrated that someone's due process rights would be harmed by failing to release this memo, which is outrageous considering the legal case that Öztürk continues to be embroiled in. So we've been filing FOIA requests basically for information that not only undercuts the administration's immigration rationale, but also its treatment of the press. And I'll stop there. I know that was a lot.
Well, we can keep going on that tip about attacks on the press. Seth, do you want to come in? Seth Stern, do you want to come in here and maybe just segue from that? There's a couple things I wanted to get at about the Enemies Act and a couple things, but since you just, Lauren, left off with other attacks on the press, Seth, do you want to chime in on that or the Öztürk case?
Well, just briefly on the Öztürk case, it's easy to talk about the case in terms of the legal issues and sort of get into the weeds of immigration law, First Amendment law, and so on. And as a lawyer, that's often my first instinct as well. But I think it's sometimes important to just take a step back and say, like, we're in the United States and someone spent a month and a half behind bars for writing an op-ed. That's incredible. I don't know that we've processed this moment at a national level as one of American history's greatest violations of press freedom, but I think it is one. It's pretty unprecedented. All this person did, and a judge, in addition to the memo Lauren spoke about it, a judge found this in ordering her release finally in Vermont. There was no evidence other than her co-authoring this op-ed, none whatsoever. And if you've read the op-ed, and this isn't to say that you can throw someone in jail for writing a radical op-ed, you can write whatever op-ed you want, but this op-ed wasn't even particularly radical. I think everyone here has seen far more radical writings than anything in that op-ed. Was the allegation that it's anti-Semitic is personally offensive to me because I'm Jewish and I agreed with virtually everything she said. So what's that make me? You know, it's an incredible moment that somebody spent a month and a half again behind bars for nothing other than writing an op-ed in the United States. What does that say for where we are as a country? And you can say that it is a Trump issue or a MAGA issue. It's not. I mean, Trump is certainly expediting trends that were already in place. No question about that. But Columbia University is hardly MAGA town. And you see students being suspended for covering pro-Palestine protests.
From the paper, from the Columbia, I mean, it's the Journalism Review. It's the I mean, just think about what's happening at that institution. Sorry to interrupt, but
No, and there are great people at that institution, and it's a shame because they've spent decades building themselves up as this, a place that promotes the free press, a place that promotes the First Amendment. They've got the Knight Institute, they've got the Columbia Journalism Review, great, important institutions. And the administration is just undermining all of that work.
They're buckling.
Potentially irreparably. I don't know how you come back from that. I mean, my kids are my kids are young. My oldest kid is 7, but if in a decade plus, when he's looking at colleges, if he's thinking about journalism schools and says, "Dad, I'm thinking about going to Columbia," I'm going to remember this. I'm going to say, "You should probably go somewhere else." So, it's a pretty sad state of affairs. The aside from that, the attacks on press freedom, it really is a laundry list. You've got the Federal Communications Commission, a supposedly independent agency that nowadays is being run by Brendan Carr, a guy who literally wears a golden lapel pin of Donald Trump on his suit jacket, and who is threatening to go after any broadcaster, both the major news networks, but also radio stations that have broadcast licenses that report things that Trump doesn't want reported. And they're doing that by claiming that broadcast licensees are obligated to operate in the public interest. They are now the sole arbiter of the public interest, and they think that the public interest overlaps entirely with what Donald Trump wants the public to hear. And that's not only an issue with the FCC, he's bringing the same approach to the IRS, because the tax code also requires tax-exempt nonprofit organizations to operate in the public interest. So again, to Trump, that means in my interest. Historically, that language has been understood to be severely limited and constrained by the First Amendment, that it's not an invitation for the government to censor what it deems outside the public interest. And maybe there has been an assumption that all administrations would understand those limitations and wouldn't try this kind of stuff. And maybe people took that for granted, and that's why the language hasn't been clarified and why those limitations haven't been codified. But, in hindsight, someone should have done something about that.
Yeah, well, in hindsight, there were certainly groups, yours among them, decrying the attacks on press freedom, regardless of the administration, regardless of party, which is the principle that's here, that's before us, is that if we did operate on the basis of protecting these principles and these values and things like the First Amendment and press freedom, we wouldn't have slid down this very now slippery and slipperier slope that we see ourselves. We talked about this in the United States of Distraction years ago, the 50-year backslide of attacks on public institutions, right? The Heritage Foundation, coming out of the Nixon years, had plans to do this that Reagan was trying to adopt. Here we are half a century later. It's sort of a redux or a continuation of those plans. It's not as if they didn't tell us what they wanted to do. It seems that there's a lack of ability to believe it, certainly a lack of spine in any kind of actual opposition party in the U.S., certainly in the Congress. What we've seen over the last decade plus is a relentless stacking of the courts, which comes right back around, Lauren, to where, we're stuck in some of these. We're kind of stuck with people like John Roberts, who helped put Trump where he is, being one of the last lines of defense against some of the assaults on the Constitution. It's a really precarious place to be. And we're talking on May 15, you and I, a federal judge in Pennsylvania, Stephanie Haynes, just ruled that, in fact, the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is appropriate because Venezuelan gangs are mounting an incursion into the United States. Lauren Harper, I mean, I know that's just one more ruling in whatever the chaos of sort of the whack-a-mole of someone in, with different judges in different districts saying different things. But can you weigh in on some of this? This is certainly a good thing.
Yeah, it seems like she literally did not get the declassified memo showing that the intelligence community disagreed with that assessment. I saw that ruling and was perplexed is an understatement. I was troubled by it. It seems to be a willful disregard of the evidence that's out there. But perhaps that ruling aside, I do think overall the courts have been more willing to question the secretive stances, not only of the administration, including the Department of Government Efficiency, but also agencies, and more so than Congress. One of the things I've been troubled by is Congress's kind of hands-off approach to the Trump administration's attempt to gobble up more power and authority, not only in the executive branch, but its apparent attempt to be doing the same thing with the legislative branch. We're seeing a lot of I think we're starting to see some congressional outrage muted congressional outrage as the Trump administration tries to gain more control, for example, over the Library of Congress. It's also trying to have the Government Accountability Office, which is a legislative branch agency, declared an executive branch agency, which would give the president more direct control over the congressional research arm. So I think this is all to say all of the things that we're seeing, in terms of its actions within the executive branch, and also, trying to stamp out dissent, even among, college journalists. The administration appears to be trying to become the sole source of information coming out of the government, and not even just the government. It's trying to dictate what private entities can say. It's an all-out assault. It's multi-pronged, and you mentioned the Heritage Foundation. It's been telling us that this is what it's going to do, and this is what it's doing. And I think you're absolutely right. There's been an unwillingness in a lot of parts, both in the government and the nonprofit sector, to really believe that this would be happening, because it challenges, the way the business has been done in Washington for 50, 60 years. Business models have to be rewritten. This is not as we've seen it before. It's time for a more concerted and unified fight back, I would say.
For the first part of the show today, we've been talking about various cases, the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on students, the attacks on free speech, free expression, a free press. And Seth Stern, I'm going to start this segment with you, because you brought something up earlier that's becoming more and more significant for us to think about, and that is, it's all around weaponization of institutions, weaponization of the Fourth Estate, weaponization of language. And we heard Lauren Harper saying, again, just before the break, there's a full-on assault on information disseminating institutions, whether it's limiting schools, controlling what teachers can teach, the rise of banned books and book challenges, the ever constant attacks on the press, calling them the fake news. And it's not just the independent press or nonprofits. We're seeing the Trump administration make really unprecedented attacks on CBS, on ABC, on major news outlets. And also the weaponization in terms of dissent and protest. And I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned, Seth Stern, and that is the weaponization of anti-Semitism is the basis of going after people like Öztürk, who simply wrote an opinion piece about their experiences and their thoughts about it, much of which was buttressed by evidence. It wasn't just wanton, ranting, so to speak. But we're in a climate right now where that's an extraordinary, it's a heightened risk, it seems, and especially the HR 9495 and current iterations of the attacks on nonprofits are looking to use pretty restrictive and pretty specific definitions of what anti-Semitism means as a means by which to silence any kind of public debate around Israel and Gaza. Seth Stern.
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the one of the leading tactics right now to silence dissent is to expand the definition of anti-Semitism to encompass criticism of Israel or even straight news reporting to expose war crimes and atrocities that Israel has been committing. And when you talk about HR 9495, which just for background is a bill that was proposed in the last Congress and was recently passed by the Ways and Means Committee in the House as part of Trump's big beautiful budget bill or whatever he's calling it. And what it would essentially do is allow the Secretary of the Treasury to deem a nonprofit organization to be a supporter of terrorism and thereby revoke its tax-exempt status with little to no due process involved. That's a concern for all sorts of nonprofit organizations, environmental organizations you could imagine being accused of supporting terrorism. But it's particularly in this moment concerning to any organizations that are doing any sort of advocacy or humanitarian work that benefits Palestinians. And it is also concerning for the nonprofit media. Last year, there was an effort led by Senator Tom Cotton, as well as other members of Congress, to have leading news outlets, the New York Times, Associated Press, I believe CNN, and others, investigated under existing terrorism, material support for terrorism laws, because they had used photographs from Palestinian journalists of the October 7th attacks. And the thinking was essentially that by purchasing those photographs or by being there to take those photographs, it's a foregone conclusion that the journalists participated in the attacks and were terrorists. And you certainly must have known that, New York Times, because obviously anytime you buy a freelance photograph, you know the entire life history of the photographer, and therefore you're supporters of terrorism. Now, that reasoning was very much unsound, and had it ever proceeded beyond letters and publicity stunts, it most likely would have failed to hold up in court, even with the state of the judiciary as we just described. But this bill would take care of that problem, at least when it comes to nonprofit news outlets, of having to go to court and prove your case. It would allow remarkably wide discretion to the Secretary of the Treasury, again, to just deem an organization a supporter of terrorism based on the flimsiest of evidence and act accordingly. And whatever appeals might be able to be filed in hindsight, the damage will likely have already been done. So although now that fits into the weaponization of anti-Semitism box you're talking about, anyone could be pursued under that that framework. And what I find disturbing is just the lack of awareness on the right among conservatives of the possibility of the shoe being on the other foot one day. Once you set this precedent, who is to stop some future administration from accusing an anti-abortion activist of being a supporter of terrorism? A pro-Israel organization that perhaps is a little friendly with settler groups of being a supporter of terrorism. Obviously, this is something that can backfire, as are so many of the policies that this administration is pursuing. And the reason that scares me is that they're acting like people who don't expect to ever not be in power again. Because if they expected to ever be in power again, you would think that they would be a little bit more cautious of what might happen when their opponents are able to wield the powers that they are developing.
Well, power is an intoxicating and disorienting thing, as history clearly illustrates. Some people pay attention to that, some people don't. But these people have said that part out loud. They've said that quiet part out loud. They've been admitting with it. They've been more than flirting with the idea that they're not leaving. And again, you would think that, the fear of that would be some guide that reminded us that This is about principles, not about who's able to manipulate them to the most gain or extraordinary gain. But that's the behavior that we're witnessing right now. It's sort of scorched earth in that regard. And look, 20 almost 25 years ago, 24 years ago, Nancy Chang writing for, Center for Constitutional Rights, there were plenty of us decrying the Patriot Act, plenty of us decrying the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And I'm old enough to remember, saying, we're gonna rue the day. This is setting the stage for the new level of authoritarianism. It's the new Cold War. It can be elasticized and expanded. One size can fit whoever they want. Here we are. We're literally seeing that kind of language, the invocation of these things. And look, it's not even just post 9/11. We're literally going back to, the Adams administration. We're going back to the 1798 act laws. This is absolutely riveting insofar as, Lauren Harper, from your perspective, legally, what do you make of just sort of it's kind of a shock and awe moment for lawfare. That's one of the issues that's been going on. So we see weaponization on the press, we see weaponization around language, weaponization of anti-Semitism, and of course now the law and what courts can do. It's a full-on assault on public institutions everywhere. Lauren Harper.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said, and I'm so glad that you brought up the Patriot Act and the creation of DHS. I feel like there's an assumption right now when we talk about DHS that it's been around forever, and oh my gosh, how did we ever survive without it? And one of my biggest concerns with DHS that I see it doing, this is a little off topic, but for a long time, we had the military-industrial complex with the Defense Department, and there were a lot of secrecy concerns there. There was, corruption, there was abuse of power. To me, it's been clear, and I think it's increasingly clear, that DHS has learned from DOD and is building its own immigration industrial complex, its surveillance industrial complex, and the public-private partnerships between DHS and contractors, similar to what DOD did with, Defense Department contractors, I think is going to be a really increasingly critical and problematic area where there's not a lot of transparency, but it's going to be ripe for profiteering and abuse. I know Eric Prince, no surprise there. He's interested in getting involved in immigration just as he was in the military sphere. So I'm so glad that you flagged that. It's the next frontier. But yeah, it is absolutely a well thought out and multi-pronged is an understatement attack on these norms. And I think one of the issues that we're seeing, I'm thinking, for example, of the jet from Qatar that is probably going to be accepted by the Trump administration to be used as Air Force One temporarily and then gifted to the Trump Presidential Foundation, is that we are seeing the exploitation of loopholes, and this is getting back to something Seth said, that we've known have existed for decades, that Congress has previously researched, that advocates have completely decried, that various members of the various administrations have said this is a problem. And in thinking of the Qatar jet, the emollients clause has gotten the most attention, but there's also a real secrecy issue with the way that foreign entities and anonymous donors can contribute to private presidential foundations with virtually no oversight. And so we're seeing the exploitation of these norms, and the Trump administration is able to say, look, so-and-so did this. Granted, it was at a smaller degree, but we're not doing anything completely new here. And I think this gets back to, the defense of these principles needs to be consistent, because the problems for the most part have already existed. They are just being exacerbated at warp speed by Trump, Stephen Miller, and others.
So, yeah, you mentioned Stephen Miller, but a moment ago, you were mentioning, the military-industrial complex, the surveillance complex. It's intricately, it is just completely intertwined with Silicon Valley. It's basically kind of taken over, a lot of the military-industrial security complex. Peter Thiel, Palantir. We're doing a 10-part series this year with Peter Byrne as a science writer called AI Military Watch, and we're kind of really looking behind the scenes at Project Censored, particularly at the increased use of this technology and in in foreign policy endeavors, right? That to be more specific, it's literally being used to target people in Gaza, for example. It's being used against Yemen. These technologies, you go back in our history, IBM helped the Nazis track Jews to send them to death camps. Here we see Silicon Valley companies helping other countries target, attack, and commit massive human rights atrocities. Another name that doesn't come up too often is Curtis Yarvin, the sort of libertarian wunderkind behind, a lot of the Silicon Valley tech bro libertarianism in the manosphere. That Elon Musk is simply like the mouthpiece for it, but like the brains behind it, whether or not people want to acknowledge it, are these people who are completely anti-democratic. They don't believe in democratic participation. They don't believe in democratic republicanism. They don't believe in free speech or free press unless it's something they agree with. And now we're back to the Heritage Foundation. We maybe should believe these people when they tell us what they're going to do the first time. Seth Stern.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know how much I have to add to that. That was very well said. I would expand it, though, to what we're seeing from, you mentioned earlier, the CBSs, the ABCs, or the Paramounts and the Disneys, I should say.
Yes.
These media conglomerates that are doing Trump's bidding, kissing up to him, settling disputes in order to essentially launder bribes through the court system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Bob Iger and Sherry Redstone, they might not be, anti-democratic the way that, Yarvis is, but similarly, for years, people have been raising alarms over corporate control of media. Project Censored, obviously one of the leading voices in that world. And many have pushed back, saying, we've got great journalism schools. Our journalists have integrity. The newsroom is sacred. And publishers and editors who get into the news business know not to interfere with editorial judgment. And if they ever attempt to, there will be an immediate revolt by news organizations. And those who doubted that were the case are finding themselves validated, although I don't think they're happy about it.
Yeah.
But we're kind of seeing, corporate owners may have at times kept themselves in the background, kept their influence somewhat muted and limited to general direction as opposed to particular editorial decisions. But when things hit the fan and when someone really put the squeeze on them and put their money on the line, they were quick to act like corporations, not like news editors, like corporations. Their money comes first. Theme parks are more lucrative than news broadcasts. Mergers are more important than 60 Minutes. If your eyes are on the dollars and cents. And now we're seeing that when it hits the fan, these news publishers are going to put their money first over the news. And we just, no matter how much we might have ignored that in the past and assumed that some of these institutions were too prestigious to be influenced by corporate considerations, that's out of the window. So we need to recommit to independent journalism and to platforming independent voices. And as bad as what you're talking about is, and it's awful, the sort of techno-fascists, the people who are straight up anti-democratic authoritarians, that's bad, but so are the people who are just looking at dollars and cents and caving to Trump because it's in their financial interests, and not just media outlets, but law firms, for example. That, you might have believed that the legal profession, it's got the rules of professional conduct. It's got this, a lot of books and a lot of libraries. They've got this sort of, integrity to them that is inherent, but no, clearly not. Law firms were quick to cave to Trump, and that creates problems for journalists, for nonprofits, for everybody who relies on pro bono or low cost representation, which law firms in the past did not out of the goodness of their hearts, And that's not to say that individual lawyers weren't acting out of the goodness of their hearts. I'm sure plenty of them were, but the law firm as a whole wasn't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They were doing it because it was a good marketing and promotional tool and got them in the good graces of people who could put money in their pockets. Now you've got a new framework for who's going to put money in your pockets. And, as Lauren said, the business model's changed.
Yeah, in fact, Seth Stern, you're reminding me, of course, of the late, great Bob McChesney's Rich Media, Poor Democracy. And, the great legacy of Bob calling out the corporate influence and corruption of the Fourth Estate. Also remind me of our founder at Project Censored, Carl Jensen, who years ago talked about the significance of our free press and our journalism schools and the great responsibilities that they had. And he quipped at one point, which I think is truer than ever. He said, our journalism schools need to churn out more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers, and that the effort would be well worth it. Lauren Harper, I wanted to turn over to you just for the last words here in today's segment. Anything else you'd like to add here to the conversation? Any places you'd like to tell people where to look for the work online? Freedom.press. Of course, you have Secure Drop at your website. You have digital security education, the great U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. Again, Freedom of the Press Foundation is an amazing resource. Lauren.
Yeah, thank you so much. Obviously, please do feel free to check out our website and all the stuff that both Seth and I and our colleagues post there. And the thing that I would just want to mention kind of at the intersection of press freedom and secrecy, there have been so many stories that have come out just in the past few months. I think one of the things the press should be doing more is challenging the government anytime it says that something is classified or secret. We're seeing the weaponization of this idea of the weaponization of intelligence, and classification is supposedly sacred. And I think we need to challenge that every time that it comes up, because oftentimes what we're seeing, this administration, like many others before it do, is say, it's classified, it's national security, we can't release it. And I think we need to systematically challenge that every time that assertion is put out there, because oftentimes that's just being put out there to hide information that is embarrassing or illegal. It's something that we do regularly at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and that I hope to see national security reporters and others do every time the administration says something should be hidden.
Absolutely. I mean, again, this is an old playbook tactic, and again, they're not going back to 1798 for nothing. It's not new to invoke the national security blanket. Lauren Harper, Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy, Seth Stern, Director of Advocacy for Freedom of the Press Foundation. I want to thank you both, not only for the amazing work that you do, but thank you for taking time out to come on the Project Censored Show and talk to us and our audiences. Lauren and Seth, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having us, Mickey. Great being here.